So let's talk about some big and chunky Primaris elites. With a pretty enormous recent points cut, it seems that the aggressors are looking pretty awesome. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and more specifically we're focusing on the Primaris Aggressor squad, another Space Marine unit that was kind of underwhelming before, but seems to have been catapulted to new highs by this big new points change. Let's talk about the models and their rules, why they're looking really quite good in the game at the moment, and then talk about some possible stacking buffs and synergy, and how I might think about using them in-game. The Aggressor Squad is Games Workshop's Primaris close assault unit in Gravis armor, big sturdy armor with a whole flurry of anti-infantry shooting attacks, and some strong melee with their power fists. I feel like when Games Workshop were designing them, they sort of had them in mind to be the Primaris version of Terminators, big chunky armor, power fists, and close assault guns, though I'd say they do have their own look and feel. The box set from Games Workshop is £32.50, €42.50 or $55. It's not very good on the points per dollar front, to be honest. Since they dropped in points so much, they're certainly one of the worst box sets in 40k for that. They are discounted in a few different combat patrol sets though. Their current models are fairly recent ones, coming out towards the start of 8th edition, with the option of either Flamestorm or Boltstorm gauntlets and the Fragstorm grenade launcher for the bolter loadout. I feel like they're probably one of the better Primaris designs, big armor, powerful weapons, and some cool guns. If you were looking to pick up any of them, then Element Games does sell them in the UK as well if you want them at a bit of a discount. I'll link that down in the video description. It seems that they currently sell them at £27.63, so 15% off. The link in the video description does also help support Auspex Tactics with any purchases through it as well, at no extra cost to yourself. Getting on to rules, and here we have the datasheet for the Aggressor Squad. They're 30 points per model now, elite choices, and you get between 3 and 6 of them in a unit. They move 5 inches, hit on 3s, a strength 4 and toughness 5 with a Gravis armor, and have a big 3 wounds, so not easy to kill with small arms. 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3+ save. The sergeant gets an extra pip of leadership and an extra attack as well. In terms of armament, they have the option of either Flamestorm gauntlets, or you trade them out for the Boltstorm gauntlets with the Fragstorm grenade launcher on top. The Flamestorm gauntlets are basically 2d6 auto hits at strength 4 AP 0. And the Fragstorm and Boltstorm loadout will basically give you 6 plus d6 shots against your targets, again at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1, but have an 18-inch range overall. The Fragstorm part of the loadout gives you the blast keyword as well, which can be kind of handy against hordes. In combat they do hit home with a fairly respectable amount of power fist attacks. With shock assault, even a unit of 3 of them will be hitting with around about 13 attacks, hitting on 4s, strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2. They do particularly well against things like toughness 7 vehicles and 2 wound Space Marines. Keywords wise, they're core infantry. They have the Primaris and the Mark 10 Gravis keywords, which are both good for stratagems, and it means that overall they're a fairly decent unit for receiving most of the buffs that the chapter has to offer. Broadly speaking, as Space Marine units go, they're at least moderately slow, fairly good close range anti-infantry damage, and a fairly respectable combat profile that's perhaps best at killing elite infantry and light vehicles. Toughness wise, I think they're decent enough for the cost. 3 wounds at toughness 5 isn't bad, though they have lost armor of contempt, which will make them a bit easier to kill than they were before per model. Currently, I'd say that the Aggressor Squad is currently looking pretty great, and the reason for that being that they've just had an enormous points cut. There used to be 45 points for the Boltstorm loadout and 40 points for the Flamestorm. Both of those loadouts are now just for 30 points, so basically a 25% points cut from the Flamestorm one and a 33% cut from the Boltstorm one. Pretty enormous there. I'll admit that they weren't enormously strong units before that, usable but not standout perhaps, and they have lost armor of contempt, but even despite both of those things, I still think that they're looking really quite threatening now. Basically much more dangerous for the points, particularly with AP -1 in Tactical Doctrine looking a lot more threatening on them, and kind of similar durability wise. Armor of contempt stings a bit, but that's easily balanced out by the massive points cut. I feel like they're definitely going to be a unit we're going to be seeing a bit more of on the table. For their weapons, you either have the choice of the Boltstorm gauntlets or the Flamestorms. Previously, when they were 5 points different, I would have said that they were kind of balanced. Now they're both 30 points, I'd probably just about give it to the Boltstorm, but there are advantages of both. The two profiles kind of have a similar sort of damage output. The Boltstorm ones get 9.5 shots on average, so an average of 6.3 hits, a little bit behind the Flamestorm automatic 7 hits, but the Flamestorms do have a big trade-off in that they're only 12-inch range, and that does mean that you will have less choice of targets in some cases. For that reason, for the price of a small damage output cut, I'd say that the Boltstorm gauntlets probably just about win out for the extra 6 inches of range, though the two profiles do have some good advantages. Boltstorm gauntlets are certainly better in Imperial Fists with exploding 6s, Flamestorm gauntlets are certainly better in Salamanders with +1 to wound and good stratagems, And the two do have some other pros and cons, such as the blast rule on those Fragstorm grenades, versus the Flamestorm having some nice buffs like ignoring modifiers, including the advance, and they have great overwatch as well. Overall, I rate the two as being fairly well balanced despite costing the same. I'd probably just about give it to the Boltstorm gauntlets, but it's not all that far between them. In terms of buffs and synergy, they're certainly going to get on pretty well with the AP-1 of Tactical Doctrine. That will be very nice on the Boltstorms and the Flamestorms, particularly now Armour of Contempt isn't a thing. Maybe just means they're a bit more valuable in chapters that are going to be progressing to the Tactical Doctrine and not just sitting in Devastator all game. I feel like as a big dangerous and damage dealing squad, you certainly can invest in some character buffs for them. Rerolls from captains and lieutenants rarely go amiss, and I feel like they're perhaps a particularly good unit to target with things like Chapter Master full rerolls. If you did manage to get in a good situation where they could shoot and then charge, you might be able to get those rerolls or rerolling to hit with their anti-infantry weapons and then with their power fists that hit on 4s. I think chaplains are fairly reasonable to run with aggressors as well. They're kind of interesting in both a shooting and assault units that just about every single litany could help them, whether it's the protection against mortal wounds or bonus to charge. I feel like they're perhaps particularly good with the close range shooting one as well, the one where they get a +1 to wound against the closest targets. With quite short range anti-infantry weapons, that's going to be pretty brutal, as they're usually going to be firing against the closest target anyway. Apothecaries could certainly work, reviving them and healing others, and a librarian seems reasonable enough for a 5+ invul save with a psychic barrier, hopefully covering a bunch of other things as well though. I certainly don't think that you want all of these, but depending on what you've got in your HQ section, I feel like one of those could certainly be handy to carry around alongside a squad. Buffs would get a bit more efficient if you had more than one unit on the board. Otherwise, for delivery, you could think about transports, I guess. They can ride in repulsors, but I'd probably say it's not really quite worth it for the cost. They did get quite a lot cheaper now, but I can't help but think you might just be better off with more aggressors on the board and not bother with a fancy ride for them. Against some armies, I guess Strategic Reserve could be a reasonable enough option now it's free. It would at least allow them to get that anti-infantry weapons into usually something fairly light on the enemy's flanks, but it would mean that they'd be kind of a bit unreliable with making charges or anything like that, and they might run into the problem of shooting a light infantry unit and then killing the models they wanted to charge, so they've got literally no chance. For stratagems, they've got a fair amount of usable ones, I think. Two nice durability ones, one in unyielding in the face of the foe for a +1 to saves against damage 1 weapons. Perhaps particularly relevant now Armour of Contempt is gone. You might actually need to use that to make sure that you're not too squishy against things like AP-1 damage 1 guns. They're far more of a threat than they were when Armour of Contempt was here. Transhuman Physiology could be decent enough, particularly for anything that was wounding them on 2s, like a Strength 10 or +1 to wound thing. Gene Wrought Might could give them a little bit of extra muscle in melee. 6s to hit auto wounding is okay. I guess it's alright if you just need every single bit of damage output. I think it's only going to be all that efficient though if you're targeting something that's say toughness 8 or above, as otherwise they'll have a pretty reasonable chance of wounding anyway. Otherwise they can Auspex scan, which can be very significant with the amount of shots they've got, and Overwatch is particularly significant for the Flamestorm version, meaning that they can be basically unchargeable by certain light units if you don't have something else to soak the fire. As a big and scary elite core damage dealing unit, I feel like literally every single chapter will have some interesting things that they can do with them, though perhaps for the most standout chapters, I feel like Salamanders and White Scars might be some of the most powerful, at least when it comes to applying their good things to this unit. First up, Salamanders get on generally just very well with Gravis armor. They've got lots of things for increasing toughness, giving them feel no pain, and they ignore AP-1, but more importantly they give the Flamers a +1 to wound, and you can use some really nice stratagems on them, like the one to get maximum shots out of your Flamers, a theoretical 72 auto hits, if you choose to build the unit out to the max size. With AP-1 and a +1 to wounds, there's almost nothing in the game that isn't going to leave quite a big mark on. Never mind if you wind up following that up with a brutal charge with fists. I feel like they get on quite well with the Salamander's stratagem, such as the counter-charge one, which means you could charge another enemy unit and then these guys could reactively charge in, or potentially the one where you self-sacrifice another unit to protect the aggressors. Maybe soak up all the firepower on a tough Blade Guard or Thunderhammer Terminator squad, and then these guys can be the counter-attack. White Scars I think are also particularly powerful. Perhaps one of the biggest weaknesses of the aggressors is they move kind of slowly and are only effective at close range. The White Scars just mean that they can happily advance an extra d6 inches literally every turn and won't suffer any lost damage either shooting or in melee. Theoretically, you could move 5 inches, get lucky and roll a big 6 to advance, so a big 11-inch move in the movement phase, then still fire at full effect, and then still charge at full effect after that, or with their chapter tactic. Means that they could potentially be getting the jump on the enemy rather than the other way around, and if you just happen to be an assault doctrine as well, then damage 3 on those brutal fists would be pretty awesome. Going from damage 2 to damage 3 is pretty massive, particularly against certain targets like Terminators. Otherwise though, I do think that literally every other chapter adds something. Ultramarines get to fall back and shoot, which might be best with all that volume fire, plus they've got all manner of stacking character buffs to put on them. Iron Hands could give you a bit of extra toughness with the Feel No Pain. I feel like they're maybe not quite as much a natural fit as some of the others, but they might well want some assault troops, and if they're running successor chapters, you could have the Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage to make their melee a lot stronger. Raven Guard are nice enough for the forward deploy Warlord trait, which I think works quite well with aggressors. You can get all that damage output into the enemy's face turn 1, or potentially get them nearer to the enemy either with pre-game moves or putting them in Deep Strike Reserve for 1 CP, popping up exactly where you need them. Imperial Fists will certainly get on very well with the Boltstorm variant. Exploding 6s to hit and ignoring cover are pretty nice for the close range firepower. Space Wolves get the heroic intervention plus a whole manner of different ways to make their melee scarier. Some really nice stratagems, a +1 to hit so you could be hitting on 3s with those fists, and a nice assault doctrine for exploding 6s that combos well with full rerolls. For the Blood Angels, I feel like the aggressors have a lot more competition with fast moving attack troops. They've got nothing against having the +1 to advance and charge though, and the +1 to wound in combat. For Dark Angels, on paper they really quite like Azrael's invul save that he can give them, plus his rerolls. Aggressors with a 4+ invul do look really quite nice, but I feel like they're almost always going to be playing second fiddle to the Deathwing Terminators, particularly as they seem to have got even more efficient in this latest update. For Deathwatch, the aggressors can be objective secured with their kill teams if you have a few heavy intercessors about. There's the option for big rerolls, flexible doctrines, and the Dominus Aegis relic for a 5+ invul save. And last but not least, the Black Templars have the 5+ invul vow. That one's very relevant for aggressors with only having a 3+ save without Armour of Contempt. They've got the Relic Bearer upgrades, which could make you a very fighty aggressor sergeant or make one tankier. And they've got some very nice support characters as well with their own unique litanies and Helbrecht and Grimaldus about. Just for a rough game plan, here's how I think about fielding the aggressors. I'm perhaps the most tempted by 5 model units, and probably with the Boltstorm and the Fragstorm loadouts. I feel like the extra range is probably better unless you're playing Salamanders, in which case I'd definitely take Flamers. I'd be tempted by the 5 model units because it's a bigger unit for extra buffs like Chapter Masters and things, but it means that you don't have any coherency issues, and it's still 1 command point for transhuman physiology if you need it, rather than 2. I'd say for support options, I probably wouldn't go absolutely wild with it, but if you did happen to have a big core of your army going on, then having a Chapter Master nearby would be pretty excellent, and Chaplains, Librarians, and Apothecaries are all very usable indeed. I'd probably be tempted just to use 2 out of that list at max though. I think you definitely could run multiple units of them and support them with multiple characters if desired. For deployment, I'd ideally want them behind cover if at all possible, but somewhere maybe fairly central where their slow movement isn't going to be as much of an issue. I feel like they maybe are one of the units that you can perhaps push up down the centre of the board towards midfield objectives. I guess depending on the enemy and the terrain, you could think about either strategic reserve or chapter specific deep strike options, but I feel like they'd be the exception rather than the rule. From there, each turn I'd weigh up advancing compared with just moving normally. I feel like often it's going to be more valuable to get more movement up the board and into the right position as opposed to absolutely maximise all the damage that you might get from Fragstorm shots. If you could find yourself somewhere safe in cover in the midfield, then that seems pretty good, and then potentially launch out some charges from beyond that. In general, I do feel like they're probably going to be a bit more of a reactive unit compared with some Space Marine things. They are a little bit slow, and there is a reasonable chance of getting charged rather than doing the charging. Ideally, they'd want to be supported by other things that can counterattack. If they do get in a situation where you take the initiative, though, with their damage output, ideally they'd want to burst out of cover, shoot dead a whole bunch of light infantry, and then try and charge something heavier or elite infantry if it presents itself. As for weaknesses, their main issues are that they aren't super fast, and they aren't enormously hard to remove if they're shot with the right guns. Anything that's damage 3 and has a little bit of AP is going to go through them pretty quickly, even with things like Transhuman. In general, I feel like they're pretty generalist in terms of damage dealing. Good stuff to deal with both heavy-ish targets and light things. Probably going to be really struggling with things like Toughness 8 and -1 damage, where neither the Power Fists or their guns are going to have too much effect. Overall, broadly though, I'd say they're looking very good. I suspect that we'll see a fair few more of them take to the board, perhaps particularly for armies like White Scars and Salamanders. They do seem to fit in fairly well there. For competitors though, they do have a fair amount of other rivals in the Space Marine Elite slots. Maybe Assault Centurions are perhaps one of the most direct competitors, They're 60 points, so double the cost of the aggressor, and get 4 wounds, toughness 5 and a 2+ save, better melee with the siege drills, and a whole bunch of shooting with the hurricane bolters and flamers at range. Overall, I'd say their melee is kind of comparable for the costs when you factor in the fact that they're double as much. The assault centurions will win out slightly against heavy armoured 3-wound infantry, whereas the aggressors will be a bit better against lighter things and 2 wounds. For shooting, the Centurions I think will out slightly at close range, though there's not loads in it between the Hurricane Bolters and the Flamers, and I feel like for the most part the aggressors will be a little bit better at deploying their firepower, having the ability to advance and shoot and not lose out on anything. Overall, I'd say they're fairly balanced. Maybe aggressors have the slight edge, as they're just quite a bit harder to kill than the Centurions now. Their extra toughness benefits are pretty nice, but I don't think it's quite worth being double the cost. The aggressors can take buffs far better as well. Otherwise, for a big threatening unit to push down the centre of the board, I do think that Thunderhammer Terminators might well be one of the units to beat at the moment. Very tough with their Storm Shields and massive melee with damage 3. They are probably trading out a bit of damage compared with the cheaper aggressors though, between the shooting and the combat, but what they lose they do gain a bit in durability. Having the 2+ save with the Storm Shield and the 4+ invul is pretty massive. Overall though, I do feel that aggressors stack up really quite well. Maybe not the most enormously hard unit to remove from the table now Armour of Contempt is gone, but unless you kill absolutely every single one, they are likely to inflict some massive pain in the turn that they get to fight back. Lots of anti-infantry shots, then a fairly impressive flurry of Power Fist attacks. Let me know what you think anyway. Would you be tempted to run some aggressors in the new Space Marine rules? Is the very cheap 30-point price tag good enough for you? And what would you think about in terms of support for them? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Otherwise, if you'd like another Space Marine video to watch, I'll link my Thunderhammer Terminator review down in the video description, another unit that got far better in this new Arcs of Omen update. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to help keep them coming on Auspex Tactics, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description below. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.